Okay, good evening, and I'll make a start. So my name's David Stensel, and I'm going to give this public lecture today on cardiac risks of excessive exercise, and try and answer the question: can too much physical activity damage the heart? Before I say that, I should welcome particularly members of the public that have come from off campus. It's really nice to see all of you here. And so many familiar faces from my colleagues, so I hope I'm not going to disappoint you tonight. So this is the outline. This is what I intend to cover in the talk. So I'm firstly going to start with some anecdotes, some little stories or anecdotes from heart attacks induced potentially by exercise. I'm then going to look at what does the evidence actually say when people have collected a bit more systematically evidence on heart attack and exercise, and how prevalent that is. I'm going to look specifically after that at triathlon and cardiac events. This is an emerging area where some evidence is suggesting that the initial swimming portion in particular of triathlon might be dangerous. I'm going to look at the evidence on running, cardiac events and mortality risk as something that was in the news a couple of years ago. There were some stories in the news about that around a particular study called the Copenhagen City Heart Study. So we'll look at that. And then look at some possible mechanisms, what might be actually, if it's true that exercise increases the risk of it or triggers a heart attack, what might be the mechanisms to explain that. And finally, look at a condition termed atrial fibrillation, which also is emerging as an area potentially where exercise performed over many years, particularly in older adults and more so in men than women, it seems at the moment anyway, exercise might actually trigger atrial fibrillation. Apparently this is all being recorded, so I won't be telling any rude jokes. But if you want to ask any questions as I go along, please feel free to do that. I'll also stay around at the end for a short while. Unfortunately, I've got to go and collect my daughter after that from an event, but I'll be around for I aim to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'll be around for about 15 minutes. If you want to email me, my email's up there. Happy for you to do that. So, firstly with some anecdotes, this is something that's in the news actually on quite a regular basis, and I mean for many years, myself and many others in the profession as exercise physiologists have said, the risk of exercise doing any damage is extremely low, and we keep on saying that, and I should say the evidence I think overall still supports that the risk is very low. But unfortunately, every time I sort of say that, there's an event that comes out in the news, and possibly one of the most notable ones back in 2012 that probably you're all aware of is Fabrice Muamba collapsing on the pitch in a game with Tottenham versus Bolton. There are some other seats if you want to. Please come and make yourselves comfortable. There's some over here and some at the back there. You're welcome. Yeah, so this was the one of the most notable events where I think technically Fabrice Muamba possibly was technically declared dead for sort of 30 to 45 minutes or in effect dead. There you go, 78 minutes it says following his collapse on the pitch. But I mean that was a success story of resuscitation and recovery, an amazing story, and he's no longer playing professionally, but well, I believe. But there's again quite a lot of cases in the news if you look over the years. So this is Mark Vivian Foe, Cameroonian footballer, dying at the age of 28 of heart-related death. I was actually giving a talk to some students in Japan back in 2011 in July, telling them that the risks were very low, and then a couple of weeks later, Naoki Matsuda dies, one of their World Cup players. This is the Italian footballer Morosini, and there are other cases, or most prominently I think in the news linked to football. But it isn't just football. This was the Norwegian swimmer Alexander Dale Owen. I think that their best hope for a gold medal in the 2012 Olympics, dying in the shower just prior to the London Olympic Games. That was May 2012. This thankfully wasn't a death, but this is the cricket player James Taylor having a heart disorder picked up, and that ended his cricket career. And obviously running. This is the London Marathon. An army captain collapsing in the 2016 London Marathon. Triathlon, I'll say a little bit more about, but this is the elite French triathlete dying at the age of 31. And I could go on. When these happen, it's evidence has suggested now that many of these cases, probably the majority, are triggered by a condition termed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So this is an enlarged heart, and this is a case particularly highlighted in the Daily Mail in 2002. Typical Daily Mail headline of fatal dedication of man who ran himself to death. But you can see how fit this chap looks. But in this case, that they attributed this to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Age of 33 he was when he died. So I'll say a little bit more about that condition in a short while. So those are the anecdotes, and we see that in the news. What does the evidence say? What's the actual? Can we quantify the risk? Well, there have been a few studies conducted in this area, and we'll look at 2 or 3 of these. This was one published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000, called the Physicians' Health Study, which involved looking at US physicians with 12 years of follow-up. And during this time, there were 122 sudden deaths amongst over 21,000 male physicians. And so what they looked at is the RR, or the relative risk, the risk of sudden death during exercise and for up to 30 minutes after exercise. So this term relative risk, for those of you that may not know, the relative means it's in comparison to a situation when people are not exercising. So in this case, in this particular study, then they quantified the relative risk as 16.9, or we could round that up to 17. So what this is saying actually was that amongst these physicians, when they were exercising or within half an hour of finishing a bout of exercise, they were 16 times more likely to have a cardiac event or a sudden death than when they were resting. So in that case, we can definitely say that exercise has increased the risk of cardiac death in comparison with the same individuals when they're not exercising. They also make the point in this paper, however, that the absolute risk of sudden death was extremely low. So here we're contrasting a relative risk with an absolute risk, and these are different things. The relative risk often sounds quite dramatic, but the absolute risk is low. So they quantified the absolute risk, as you can see here, as one sudden death for every 1.5 million episodes of exercise. The other thing that came out of this study was that your risk of actually collapsing and dying while doing exercise differs depending on whether you habitually do strenuous exercise or don't habitually do strenuous exercise. So if we look at the table here, so we've got the effect of habitual vigorous exercise, so what people usually do in their daily lives, on the risk of sudden death during and for half an hour after a bout of vigorous exercise compared with light or no exercise. So here we see that the first row is people that habitually do vigorous exercise less than one time per week. And in those people, the relative risk of vigorous exercise triggering sudden death was 74-fold. So they were 74 times more likely to collapse and die during exercise than when they were resting. If we look at the next row down, those people did usually, habitually, between 1 and 4 times a week, they did vigorous exercise. So their relative risk was 18.9 or 19. So it was still an elevated risk, but it was much lower than in those who don't habitually do vigorous exercise. And the last row there is those that do 5 or more times vigorous exercise every week. And in those people, the risk was 11, or 10.9 or 11. So still elevated, but much, much lower than those who aren't habitually doing vigorous exercise. So that was the key finding of this American Physicians' Health study. Even before that, actually, there was a study. This looked at the risk of exercise triggering a myocardial infarction, so a heart attack, this looked at the risk in people grouped according to their frequency of habitual vigorous exercise. This study looked at men as well as women, and again we see a similar sort of story compared with as with the previous study that I've just discussed. So here we've got the frequency of heavy physical exertion per week: 0, 1 to 2 times, 3 to 4 times, and 5 or more. This is plotted on a logarithmic scale, so you can see that in those doing less or doing no vigorous exercise a week habitually, they had a 100-fold increase of triggering a heart attack compared with when they were resting. In those that did 5 or more, the risk was only 2-fold, just a little over 2-fold higher than when they were resting. The definition of heavy exertion here, and the studies don't always use the same definition. The definition here is 6 METs, and again, if you're not sure what a MET is a multiple of the resting metabolic rate. So 6 METs would be six times as much energy expenditure as when you're resting. If you quantified that, it's probably very, very fast walking or slow jogging. More recently, there was a paper published in 2012 that looked specifically at running, so cardiac arrest during long-distance races. So here, this paper analysed data from over 10.9 million runners. And again, let's put this risk in perspective. Then, in absolute terms, 59 cardiac arrests in 10.9 million runners is a very low risk. Most of these were men, so more men than women. The mean age was 42, and if we want to quantify the incidence rate, it was 0.54 per 100,000 participants. This study also observed a higher incident rate in marathons than half marathons, which I guess would make sense because you're out there for longer, and a higher incidence in men, and that has increased in the last decade. They also in this study looked at the causes, so that here in this table we see survivors and we see non-survivors, and really I'm just showing this table to make the point again that what seems to be triggering these cases in the cardiac arrest in the majority of cases is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I've highlighted those values in red. So if we look at the first row in the non-survivors here, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy plus means that the autopsy suggested that it was an enlarged heart, and the plus means there may have been some other comorbidities there. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy on its own means that was the only triggering event that they could identify. And if we add those red figures up, we comes to about 50% of the causes of cardiac arrest are related to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There was a consensus statement published in 2007. I don't think that there's been anything more recent, but if there has, please correct me. So this placed these risks into perspective quite nicely. What they said, the first point to make is habitual physical activity reduces coronary heart disease risk. There are many studies that have shown that, and that still remains true. The second point, which I've shown you some of the evidence for, is that vigorous exercise, transiently, briefly, increases the risk of sudden death and myocardial infarction, heart attack. So when we say transiently, that increase in risk is happening while you're exercising, and it's happening for at least half an hour, possibly a little longer, after you've finished exercising. Now, what causes that? Well, the third bullet point there, hereditary or congenital, so birth defects or cardiovascular abnormalities are predominantly responsible for these heart attacks when they happen in young people. So all the cases I showed you of the footballers, in practically all of those cases, they've already got an underlying genetic predisposition due to an enlarged heart with thickened walls. And the exercise has then triggered that, but there is an underlying condition that's there. When it happens in older adults, it's usually different. So the atherosclerosis, underlying cardiovascular disease, hardening and narrowing of the arteries, the coronary arteries in particular, is primarily responsible for these events when they happen in older adults. And finally, the incidence of both acute myocardial infarction and sudden death is greatest in the habitually least active individuals performing sudden unaccustomed exercise. Okay, so that's a little look at the evidence and placing some statistics on what the risks actually are. I'm going to take a quick look at triathlon because there hasn't traditionally been lots of data on triathlon, but there's been there is emerging data now. I mean, why I think triathlon is quite important is there's a lot of what they call mammals, middle-aged men in lycra, doing, and to a lesser extent women, but you know, having these midlife crises, and that's probably unfair of me, but you know, and there's a bit of machoism that goes with this as well, and you see, and so this is the CEO Paul Reynolds of Canaccord dying after a triathlon related incident that was in the news in 2015, and of course others as well. This was somebody that went missing in a lake during a race in Kent, and I think they put that down to cardiac arrest there. And this was Scientific American speculating, why is swimming the most deadly leg of a triathlon? Well, firstly, we need to know, is there actually evidence for that? And there isn't much evidence out there, but it is emerging now. So this was a research letter published in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2010. And they looked at deaths in triathlon events, and you can see there were over 959,000 participants. And again, so it's rare because that was the participants. I think this is USA Triathlon sanctioned events. Only 14 deaths out of those 900,000 participants. If you look at the next row down, there's the race segment. We see swimming. 13 of those 14 deaths, or 93%, were in the swim, one in the bike ride, and none on the runs. They didn't really find any pattern in the swimming events of the length of the swim. So 6 in short swims, 4 in medium swims, 4 in long swims. There was a pattern for more deaths in males than females, and worryingly, you know, the number has been increasing over the years. So 2 in 2006, 4 in 2007. And 8 in 2008. So there seems to be something going on with triathlon and with swimming in triathlon. That's a research letter just last month, actually, published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, was this paper, Death and Cardiac Arrest in US Triathlon Participants from 85 to 2016, when this was a case sort of series report where they just went out looking for cases. And this confirmed really the research letter that was published in 2010 in JAMA. So that the key findings of this were that 85% of these deaths and cardiac arrests were in men, and that they were most of them were in the swimming segment of the triathlon. Again, if we want to quantify it, we see some figures are given here. So 1.74 events per 10,000 participants, 2.4 in men, 0.74 in women per 100,000. And the risk substantially increased with age and was much greater for those aged 60 years and older. So if you're 59, go and do that triathlon now. They also identified that in autopsy that there were cardiovascular abnormalities, most frequently atherosclerosis, which links in with the conclusion I made earlier. And so that they conclude that deaths in cardiac arrest during triathlon are not rare. I mean, that's their conclusion, and they occurred most often in middle-aged and older men, mostly in the swimming event. I don't think there's any definitive conclusion yet or evidence of why it's happening in the swim. There has been some speculation. The swim event is typically the first event in a triathlon, and it's been speculated that there's quite a profound elevation in catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, at the start of a race, and so that just happens to be swimming because it's triathlon, and that when you've got this high increase in adrenaline, that you're more likely to develop an arrhythmia, and if that's a ventricular arrhythmia, that's extremely dangerous and could cause a cardiac event. There's also some speculation that this is happening more often in novice triathletes than in well-trained triathletes, and that this may be their first exposure to open water, and that in combination with the elevated adrenaline and the general crowds in the water at that time, may contribute. Okay, so that's a little bit on the emerging area there of triathlon and swimming in triathlon. What about more specifically running and cardiac events and also mortality risk? So James O'Keefe, if any of you are interested to pursue this further, is a cardiologist in particular that is quite vocal about the damage he believes exercise can do to the heart. And if you're really interested to follow up on this, if you Google James O'Keefe TED Talk, he does a really eloquent 20-minute TED Talk on this. And he's published some nice papers, and the quotation I've highlighted here is if one is training to be able to run at speeds of above 7.5 miles per hour, which for runners, particularly younger runners, really isn't that fast. This is better done for some reason other than further improvements in life expectancy. So he says run for your life at a comfortable speed and not too far. And he's got some nice literature if you want to look at that. I'm just going to go through a couple of studies that aren't focused on runners, but just do give us some insights into this area. So for all of my colleagues in the room, they'll be very familiar with this Harvard Alumni Health Study that's Ralph Paffenbarger's work. The American epidemiologist published an awful lot of work showing the benefits of regular exercise. But this is one of the classic slides from Ralph Paffenbarger's work, where he quantified people according to the amount of physical activity they did in a week. So this index is in kilocalories per week. The least active people are here, so they do less than 500 kilocalories per week of exercise. And then we go through each category, so an increase of 500 each time, until you reach the group doing 3,500 or more, expending 3,500 or more kilocalories per week in activity. Now, that doesn't really mean very much, but if you wanted to quantify that, to give an example, we have a rule of thumb that if you walk a mile, it expends about 100 kilocalories. And so less than 500 kilocalories means these people are doing the equivalent of less than 5 miles of walking a week, really not very much. And then this group at the other end are doing the equivalent of about 35 miles of walking per week. And the take-home message from this slide is that the more activity you do, the lower the risk of all-cause mortality of death from any cause. So that's the good news. This last group here raises the question mark: is there a point at which too much exercise begins to be damaging? So this is the group with 0.62. So this group have a 48% lower risk of dying during the observation period than the least active group, but obviously their risk is a bit higher than the group before them. So this raises the question: is this the point where the relationship starts to turn? Also, again, this study is not related to running per se, but this is a study in Taiwan which had over 400,000 men and women. This is daily physical activity duration in minutes. and all-cause mortality reduction. Okay, so as you go up the y-axis there, that's better. The higher you go, the greater the reduction in the risk of death during the observation period. But the reason for showing this slide is that we see a plateauing. So the vigorous exercises are those with the blue broken line there, and we see that once we get about past about or up to about 40 to 50 minutes, that has plateaued there, suggesting that more exercise isn't going to be beneficial, more vigorous exercise, and it possibly might turn the other way. When we look at the moderate exercise, that's the broken green line, the lowest line there, and we see that in that case you have to reach about 1.5 hours of exercise per day before that plateauing seems to occur, and the red line in the middle with percentages above it is the overall risk in the whole group, regardless of intensity of exercise. So the point here is there seems to be a plateauing after a certain amount of exercise, and that seems to occur earlier if you talk about vigorous exercise. So that's not specifically running, and neither is this again, but this is a look at cardiorespiratory fitness. So now we're looking at a characteristic rather than a behaviour now, how fit people are, and do you get protection from being fitter? And in this study, fitness is quantified in METs, these multiples of the resting metabolic rate. So we see that in this particular study, the highest risk of death was in those whose exercise capacity was less than 7 METs. So that's our least fit group there, and they had the highest risk of death. And as we go through, as people were fitter, the risk of death was lower. But again, the reason for showing this is we seem to get a plateauing. Once you get to about 10 METs, really, which, again, as physiologists who study people who are extremely fit, this 10 METs value wouldn't be regarded as extremely fit. You certainly don't need to be going out and running every day, or even 4 days a week to get that kind of exercise capacity. So again, there seems to be a plateauing here, suggesting you don't need to do too much. And this specifically looking at running distance here and the risk of all-cause mortality. It's evidence like this which is beginning to perhaps prompt people to think, well, maybe we ought to introduce some limits here. So this suggests a U-shaped association. People doing, in this example, no running a week have been assigned a relative risk of 1, and we see that those that are running up to 4.9 miles a week, or 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, in each of those 4 groups, their hazard ratio is lower. They seem to be protected from all-cause mortality. But in those doing more than 20 miles a week, whilst they're still a little lower than the reference group, the relationship has turned. So if we look at this specifically, we might say that 20 miles a week of running might be the limit if we're purely interested in enhancing our health. And this was the study that made the headlines on the BBC News. So training very hard, as bad as no exercise at all. So this was data from the Copenhagen City Heart Study. If we look at what they actually did, they quantified or they classified rather runners in their study as either light joggers, so that is the L there in the table, moderate joggers, the M there, and strenuous joggers, based on their self-reported pace of running, so how fast they self-report running, the amount of running they do, the total quantity of running, and the frequency, how frequent. It's a little complicated there, but basically the faster the pace, the greater the volume of running, and the greater the frequency, the more likely they are to be classified as strenuous, and conversely for those classed as light. And this was the finding that prompted that headline about strenuous exercise might be as bad as doing no exercise at all. So here you see the first set of data is adjusted for age and sex. So of course, if you're older, you're more likely to die, so you've got to adjust for that. And similarly, they adjust for whether you're male or female, because there are different risks in those two sexes. So you see the sedentary joggers are our reference group. They're given a hazard ratio of 1. And we see that in this study, the light joggers had a much lower hazard ratio up here, and the moderate joggers a lower hazard ratio, so they seem to be protected by their running. Although this is an observational study, we can't attribute cause effect. But when we look at the strenuous joggers, they don't appear any different, and actually that risk goes up to 3.6 times higher, or 8.8 times higher when they're adjusted for age, sex, smoking, alcohol intake, education, and diabetes. So that was the basis of that headline: training very hard, as bad as no exercise at all. If you look a bit carefully at that, though, you see that in the strenuous jogger group there actually were only 2 deaths, and so several people pointed this out. That this could very easily just be a statistical artifact, and hence the BBC changed their mind a few months later and put why strenuous runs may not be so bad for you after all. So do your homework before you put your headlines out. This is the fairly well-known case of Mika True, and this is the speculation in Run as well. Did running cause Mika True's death? So if you don't know about this, very interesting man that American who this is what I've managed to divulge actually from the web. So I won't, I think this is authentic, and I've read it in several sources now. But apparently dropped out of modern civilization and went to live with these Tarahumara Indians in Mexico, who nicknamed him the White Horse, Cabello Blanco White Horse. And it's reported that he often ran distances of 25 to 100 miles in a day. And in March 2012, he was on a 12-mile training run in New Mexico, and he dropped dead. And I think it took a few days to find his body, but he was 58 when he died, and an autopsy classified or classed his death as unclassified cardiomyopathy. They actually didn't have any medical records on him because apparently he never visited a doctor. And as you can see, he looks extremely healthy there. But that was the classification of his death. Obviously, that's anecdotal there. So, what are the possible mechanisms by which exercise might trigger a heart attack? Well, I've mentioned 2 or 3 times now hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So what is this? It's an inherited, I got this from the British Heart Foundation, by the way. It's an inherited disease of the heart muscle, in which the heart muscle walls, both the left and right ventricle, are thickened. And thickened walls compromise cardiac function. So obviously if you've got a thicker wall, it's harder actually to pump blood around the body. But also these thickened walls can compromise the conduction of the electrical signal within the heart muscle. So they can cause dangerous, any arrhythmia in a ventricle is dangerous in particular. And it's reckoned that about 1 in 500 people in the UK have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There are other studies looking at other aspects that suggest that exercise might be damaging to the heart, although I've got to be honest with you, whether this is just a transient effect or whether this is actually very genuine damage, we're not really sure. So this is a particular study where they looked at a protein called cardiac troponin, which is a protein found in cardiac muscle and wouldn't normally be present in the blood. And if somebody's had if you take a blood sample after a heart attack, and if somebody's had a heart attack, you will find elevated levels of cardiac troponin. So it's a standard biomarker for diagnosing a cardiac event or a myocardial infarction. And these are the values in each of the 71 participants of the Boston Marathon in 2011. And you can see there's a range, so some of them get very little elevation. But in quite a few of these runners, the cardiac troponin levels have been increased or appear to have been elevated by the marathon. Now, as I say, whether that's just a transient, benign episode or whether there is long-lasting damage as a result of that, don't know. This is some more convincing evidence, albeit not in humans, but in trained rats. So in this study, what they looked at was a 16-week training study and had two groups of rats. They had a sedentary group, so that's shown by the orange bars there, and they had a trained group, an exercise group, which is shown by the blue bars there. And we see these are the findings at 4 weeks, these are the findings at 8 weeks, and these are the findings at 16 weeks. And actually there weren't any significant differences until 16 weeks here. And what these actual bars are showing is, so these bars over here, RVFW, that's right ventricle free wall. So that's the outside wall of the right ventricle, not the septum, not the middle, the wall between the two ventricles. And here you can see already at 4 weeks, that's higher in the exercised group than the untrained group. And this is percentage fibrosis. So that's what we're looking at. What percentage of the right ventricle free wall has fibrosis? And we see that that's 4% there. It rises to 5% in the exercised animals by 16 weeks, which is twice as high as in the sedentary group. Didn't find any differences in the intraventricular septum, so the wall between the two ventricles, or in the left ventricular free wall. So it seems to be the right ventricle where the damage is being done. And so this is fibrosis they've measured, and so fibrosis, as I've indicated there, is a thickening and a scarring of connective tissue, usually as a result of injury. And the significance of fibrosis, again, is that it can interfere with the electrical activity of the heart and can lead to arrhythmias. And you see the histology here where it actually can show that this is the sedentary rats, this is the exercised rats, and these red patches here are where they're detecting this fibrosis, which fairly convincingly, since this is a study with a control group and an intervention group, seems to suggest that this is 60 minutes of daily running for 16 weeks in these rats. So if I summarise this before going on into the last section then, so what we can say is people who exercise regularly have lower rates of disability and a mean life expectancy that's 7 years longer on average than their inactive contemporaries. I should say this is a summary from an article on the physiology of potential heart damage with exercise. However, a safe upper dose limit potentially exists, beyond which the adverse effects of exercise may outweigh the benefits. I should say that I think it's very hard to actually quantify what that upper safe dose limit might be, and I think it might vary a lot depending on the individual. Chronic exercise, intense and sustained exercise, causes patchy myocardial fibrosis, particularly in the atria, intraventricular septum and right ventricle. The intraventricular septum, that didn't show in the study that I just showed you, but when they summarised the evidence overall, they've concluded that, creating a substrate for atrial and ventricular arrhythmias. I haven't shown you all of this evidence here, but they also concluded that chronic excessive sustained exercise is associated with coronary artery calcification. So this is the inclusion of calcium into the coronary arteries, which would harden and stiffen the arteries. Diastolic dysfunction, so when the heart's at rest there's a dysfunction, and large artery wall stiffening. And then moving on then we'll take a brief look at atrial fibrillation. They concluded that veteran endurance athletes, i.e. marathon runners, ultramarathon runners, professional cyclists, may have up to a 5-fold increased prevalence of atrial fibrillation, which I'll define in a minute. And lastly, intense endurance exercise efforts often cause an elevation in biomarkers indicative of myocardial injury, and those correlate with transient reductions in right ventricular function. So I mentioned troponin, and there's another B-type natriuretic peptide here. So these are biomarkers for myocardial injury, though again I will emphasise that whether there's been an injury with these transient exercise bouts, don't know, but they're used as markers, and they do actually correlate with reductions in the right ventricular ejection fraction. So the amount of blood that can be ejected from the right ventricle is reduced sometimes after a prolonged endurance event. That's a transient thing, and there's a recovery. The question is whether over the long-term damage is being done. Okay, last thing to just take a quick look at is atrial fibrillation. So atrial fibrillation may be defined as chaotic electrical activity that replaces normal sinus rhythm. So it's very erratic, and as I put there, it limits the contribution of atrial contraction to left ventricle filling. So obviously, we all know that blood from the left atrium is emptied into the left ventricle, and if you lose that, because the contraction is erratic, it's just fibrillating rather than actually squeezing all the blood out of the atrium and into the ventricle. That means that less blood is being pushed into the left ventricle, and hence it's reducing cardiac output. It's reducing the amount of blood that is ejected from the heart. So your pump, probably the best way of phrasing this, the pump is compromised and is pumping less blood and therefore less oxygen than it normally would be. That actually isn't the major problem with atrial fibrillation. You can survive pretty well with atrial fibrillation, and it can be fairly benign in most people from the point of view of, well, it would definitely compromise your running ability, but you can function on a daily basis. Most people can walk around fine and do daily activities fine. The real problem with atrial fibrillation is it increases your risk of a stroke, because blood pools in the atrium, and it doesn't get emptied. Some of the blood doesn't empty. It stagnates, it clots, it can adhere to the side of the atrium, and at a later date, that clot will get dislodged and make its way eventually up to the brain, causing a stroke. So that's the single strongest risk factor for stroke, stronger than high blood pressure, for example. Prevalence in the UK, about 2% of the population, but amongst all of us, there's a 1 in 4 lifetime risk of developing atrial fibrillation. And similarly in America, we see 2% of young people, 9% of older people with atrial fibrillation. So the question here is, can something that we associate with a healthy habit, exercising, actually be unhealthy for the heart and increase the risk of a stroke? And again, this is something that's been picked up in the news. So athletes beware, endurance training may make it more likely that you will need a pacemaker, scientists believe. And where is the evidence for this? Well, actually there is evidence emerging. This is a review paper published in 2012, and in this paper they looked at the prevalence of atrial prevalence and risk of atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter AFL, which is a related condition, in various groups of athletes. It's not comprehensive. I would say it's an early or preliminary type of study. We can see that the age range varies from 26 in the elite athletes through to 60, mid to late 60s in these latter groups here. Most of these studies are in men, so 100% of the participants in most of them are men, but study 3 is 50% men, 50% women, and study 1 has about 30% women. And then we see percent AF. Some of these studies have a control group. So this second study here, non-elite marathon runners, 4.9% had atrial fibrillation. Controls only 0.7%. If we look at orienteers, these veteran elite orienteers, 5% of them had atrial fibrillation, 9% of the controls. Cross-country skiing, a type of activity characterised by very high levels of endurance fitness, but quite prodigious amounts of endurance exercise, and the prevalence there they found in those veteran cross-country skiers was nearly 17% of them had atrial fibrillation. Again, they were an older group, 69 years of age on average. Again, if we look at animal studies, there is evidence from animal studies that exercise actually can trigger atrial fibrillation. So this is title of this paper, Atrial Fibrillation Promotion by Endurance Exercise. And in this paper, they exercised rats over 16 weeks and were able to demonstrate that when they got these rats to do daily exercise, 1 hour daily, that those in the trained group were more likely to develop atrial fibrillation over the 16 weeks. However, again, to add to the complexities of this and what makes it so difficult to generalise is that you can find reports of people who do huge amounts of exercise and have completely normal heart function. So this is a case report, a 6-time Ultraman winner and a normal heart, a case report. So if you look at what this chap does or did, 47-year-old male, 6 times Ultraman winner, 50,000 hours of training and competition, 35-year-long career, 25 to 30 hours a week of training. So that's 25 times higher than the recommended dose for health. When they investigated this man's heart comprehensively, they found no major abnormalities in the electrocardiograms, whether that was in rest or during exercise, transthoracic echocardiogram and MRI scanning. So no enlargement of the heart, no thickening of the walls, no abnormal electrical activity. In fact, after his complete evaluation, his heart was found to be quite normal. So, it's going to be hard for me or any other exercise physiologist to tell somebody you're doing too much exercise. We can only present the evidence and let people make their own minds up. But that's his personal sport history, and you can see it started from sort of 6 years old all the way through, and he did a huge amount of exercise and nothing wrong with his heart. So the key points here at the moderate levels, this is fairly preliminary still. I still think we need a lot more on atrial fibrillation, but moderate levels of exercise reduce the risk of atrial fibrillation. Very high physical activity levels seem to increase the risk, or at least are associated with a higher risk. I should point out the effect is modest, so it's not a very strong effect, and there doesn't appear to be an effect on mortality. So even if doing a lot of exercise is likely to trigger atrial fibrillation, there isn't any evidence at the moment that it's likely to shorten your mortality. And there isn't enough evidence to give a firm threshold at the moment. And the evidence is still coming out. So this was a paper published in the British Medical Journal just, 2015. They looked at exercise capacity, so how fit you were, muscular strength, and the risk of vascular disease and arrhythmia in over 1 million Swedish men. And again, seems to confirm that they found a direct association with the risk of AF. So the fitter people were, the more likely they were to have AF. And a U-shaped association with bradyarrhythmia. So this is an abnormal slowing of the heart, and that the risk of that was highest in either sedentary people or very active people. But moderately active people seem to have some protection. And a study in confirming this again, just Journal of the American Medical Association, confirming that long-distance skiers have a higher risk of atrial fibrillation, but even amongst long-distance skiers who'd had a stroke and had atrial fibrillation, their overall risk of mortality was not elevated. So, to summarise, vigorous exercise transiently increases the risk of a heart attack, but the overall risk remains low. A habit of regular moderate exercise appears to be beneficial, both for longevity. It appears to be beneficial for longevity, but excessive levels may be detrimental, or may at least pull you back to the same state as if you didn't do any exercise. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the major factor underlying cardiac death in young people with exercise. Atherosclerosis is the major triggering factor with exercise in older adults. And if you want to know what an older adult is, by the way, I was very depressed sitting in a presentation where I was told that if you're above 50, you're an older adult. So I'm now officially an older adult. Emerging evidence suggests a link between prolonged endurance exercise performed over many years and atrial fibrillation, but we can't really give a threshold for that at the moment. And I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for listening.